One. All right, Mr. Phil, welcome to the Renegades. Very great to have you on. How are you doing today?
Stellar, man. Ready to talk about a lot of stuff today, but I'm stoked to be on your show.
Sweet. Yeah, let's do it. I'm really stoked. We're going to be talking about the IMF and kind of Bitcoin versus the state, that kind of relationship. And before we do, if you could just tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. So, obviously, I'm a Bitcoiner. I was first and foremost a musician, and I've focused a lot of my time this past year putting those two together. I wrote a song called ETF, which stands for End the Fed. You can find it anywhere music streams. My artist name is just Mr. Pseu, my Twitter handle. That's MRPSEU. And yeah, I'm passionate about Bitcoin and how fixing the money really does fix the world. There are just so many nooks and crannies of knowledge that you expose yourself to. And my intention with ETF was to, as I quote in the issue 6 volume of Citadel 21, I wrote an essay about it. And I want to put economic earworms of the sound money revolution into people's skulls. So my intention was to write a catchy rock and roll song with my inspirations of all the happenings that happened not only in 2020 and the whole market crash, but how all this stuff really happens and just being influenced by Austrian economics and how different instruments of finance and obfuscation just cause people to do crazy things. So, thank God for Bitcoin. That's why a lot of us have hope. So, I'm really proud of that, especially the video part, because I collaborated with Richard James, who made the Hard Money Film documentary. If you haven't checked it out yet, go to hardmoneyfilm.com, and he basically gives a just I guess biography of or documentary, of course, a documentary of the history of money and why Bitcoin's important. And he takes all this amazing old school film and just cartoons and imagery of history, and he overlays it with quotes from Bitcoin podcasts of the 19 what the fuck happened 1971 guys, Ben Prentice and Heavy Arm Clown, Guy Swan, Savagina Moose, some clips from Rothbard, all that great stuff. So him and I worked on the imagery of that video ETF, and then Biko Yanowski did the artwork for it, which is a cartoonish monster version of the Federal Reserve, and a big old orange Bitcoin comet is flying right into it, and it's kind of like my baby. And right now I'm after almost a year, I was in the studio yesterday and going back tomorrow to finish up the acoustic version of that song, because one of my favorite bands, Neck Deep, has put out a recent record, and they're putting out acoustic versions of some of the songs, and I was really inspired by that band and by what a lot of bands are doing. So I want to break that down, and it'll give me a good fun opportunity to experiment with like less is more, kind of like a woodsy organic approach, add some more harmonies, all that fun nerdy stuff. But that's what I'm really about. I'm sound money maximalist. Bitcoin's the way. Shitcoins are a scam.
Yeah,
and
toxic.
and we'll talk about it very much. I'm a very healthy, toxic, irresponsibly or responsibly long Bitcoin maximalist, and we're going to get into more of a global shitcoinery as we talk more about the IMF and World Bank. But really, that's my story so far, and I'm sticking to it. I've got a podcast called A Boy Named Pseu, like the Johnny Cash song, but of course, Pseu is spelled Pseu, where Andrew, like yourself, it's a originally libertarian based podcast. But ever since I found Bitcoin, I am like, let's stop LARPing. Let's get on the brightest minds in the space.
Yep.
And we have a tool that we can actually implement and learn even more about, and it brings everyone together because Bitcoin's gravity is just that powerful.
It is.
And yeah, I'm
Yeah.
also a occasional writer. My first piece for Bitcoin Magazine just dropped. It's entitled Bitcoin Blowback, um, History of Dollar Hegemony, Economic Warfare, and a Bright Orange Alternative. And I think some of that stuff will just kind of by default come into discussion for today's topic on the IMF or World Bank. But that's also what I like to do in my spare time.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Thanks for letting us know. Um, can you repeat the name of that documentary one more time?
It's hardmoneyfilm.com. I think he just called it Hard
Hardmoneyfilm.com.
Money.
Okay.
And he may have made two extra, but the preceding one was just simply called Anatomy of the State, and that's anatomyofthestatefilm.com, I believe. And it's another documentary that he did on Rothbard's piece Anatomy of the State, and he takes the majority of Guy Swan's read of Anatomy of the State, which came out last summer, and does the same thing, just rips audio from podcasting, has great visualizations. But Richard James is just he's an artist in his own right. So
Right
check
on.
that film out as well.
Right on. Yeah, it's funny because you and I both were libertarians before we got into Bitcoin, and I can't imagine like not being in Bitcoin at this point because Bitcoin is hope. Yeah, like I mean, everybody says Bitcoin is hope, and Bitcoin is basically anarchy. I mean, it's a voluntary system. There are no rulers. There are rules. There are consequences to breaking those rules. And the two are like definitely, ideologically aligned. And that's why most Bitcoiners are really awesome, freedom minded libertarian type people. But yeah, so jumping right into it with the IMF, I mean, most people have absolutely no idea what it is. And even if you have read about it, I mean, it's probably still somewhat confusing for you. I guess the best place to start with this. I mean, tell us about the IMF and who they are. I guess that's a good place to start.
Absolutely. And I just want to quickly riff off of the whole libertarian thing. It's kind of, you find Bitcoin, and I'm surprised you're not kind of already by default liberty focused, because what Bitcoin is so important, why it is because we have the separation of money and state. And that's the biggest thing. You look back in history and empires fall because of the corruption of the money supply. And to just jump into the IMF and World Bank, we can't talk about it without mentioning the Federal Reserve. The Fed is really the IMF's accomplice and protege, and the reason for its existence, it's the lifeline, and it's nothing without the Fed. And so you can kind of think of the Fed as being the blueprint of the IMF slash World Bank. So to get into things, the IMF and the World Bank's announced goals were to facilitate international trade and to stabilize the exchange rates of national currencies. And we'll get into more of that. I just want to give kind of a brief kind of oversight. You could argue that there were some unannounced goals, and some of them being the elimination of the gold exchange standard as the basis of currency valuation, and maybe arguably kind of establish kind of like we're already accustomed to social programs, and maybe establish a social financial program of the world. And we can compare this back to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was created because the larger banks like JP Morgan were threatened by the Wildcat banking era, where you had these banks with their own currencies and they were booming and busting. And even though a lot of them failed, it was still taking away the market share of JPM and others. And it was just another example of just stamping out free market incentives, because it's a threat to the establishment, because free markets actually make people thrive, and we want that healthy relationship of failed businesses and non-failed businesses, and that healthy Talebian example of you can't control Mother Nature. You need a forest fire to burn things away and have the forest fire diminish on its own. And when we go to really, if you think about it, the Federal Reserve was a banking cartel, as some call it, again, controlling the money supply. And their excuse, well, Fed bailouts are healthy because we're the protectors of the public. These institutions are too big to fail. And especially today, we saw that in 2008 and with COVID, all these corporations are too big to fail because everyone is dependent on them. And so in steps the money printer, or just taxpayer dollars, and it's monetary chaos. So the IMF and World Bank, again, were blueprints, and those words are hard sometimes. Those blueprints were originated at the Bretton Woods conference, with the same concept of above. But these financiers and politicians and theoreticians, or really it was the United Nations that met at Bretton Woods, they were incentivized to gather together for a couple of reasons. One was during the Great Depression, nations they were threatened by nations devaluing their currency because they were pegged by the gold exchange rate, and the United Nations or member states couldn't really control that, and that just led to another, again, like more free market activity on the global stage. And during the Great Depression, they were hiking imports on each other, and just it was free markets trying to do what free markets are meant to do, that fail and rebirth kind of thing that was mentioned earlier. And so Bretton Woods was a way to kind of make this better version of the Treaty of Versailles, which the Treaty of Versailles happened at the end of World War One, and that was arguably kind of like both the Treaty of Versailles and Bretton Woods was to help fund insolvent nations during times of war, again World War One and Two. And in this case, it was, or I think both cases, it was the European allies paying back the U.S. because the U.S. is basically the bank of everyone, especially during the times of war, but to pay them back for reparations and loans to rebuild their countries. And the European allies kind of recommended on the insolvent and hyperinflated German economy to pay back those those said loans to fund the like rebuilding of Europe. So all these allied nations basically depended on they picked on Germany to fund them back, because hey, we won, so pay us up our money so we can pay back these loans to the U.S. And it was just kind of chaos, and arguably all that stuff kind of led to more global economic crisis, as banks, as they do, just create uh, too much dependency on each other. And this led to the need for more economic oversight. So that's where we have the IMF and the World Bank come in. So you can think of it also as, with the Federal Reserve, it was a domestic game of bailout. And the same concept applies on the global level. So at the international level, their version of game out is similar to America or anywhere else, with a central bank, with the objective to have the taxpayers cover the defaults of loans, so the interest payments can continue going to the banks. But the differences from domestic and international are, instead of justifying this as protecting the American public, the pretense is that it's to save the world from poverty. That's one of the big IMF World Bank slogans. Is, I believe, there's a quote or slogan kind of chiseled out on like the sign at the World Bank that John Perkins mentions in his book Confessions of Economic Hitman. And the point two is that the main money pipeline goes from the Federal Reserve to the IMF/World Bank. We'll get into that a little later. But otherwise, the same concepts and rules apply, is that you have a large financial institution that is dependent on the plebs and their money to bail them out, either through taxation or inflation, which is just a sneaky, demented, more sick way of taxation.
Yeah. I mean, and if their goal is to help reduce world poverty, then they're doing a pretty bad job at that since their
Oh yeah,
inception.
oh yeah.
Um,
We'll get into that. It's a very very interesting mechanism that they've created to reach whatever objectives they have.
So, what one question that comes to mind, and if you want to continue, if you feel like you want to continue on, totally fine. But if you feel that you can address this now, then great. Where do they? I mean, for somebody new to this, where does the IMF even get their money?
So as I mentioned, they're dependent on the world banks. Like the IMF and uh, World Bank can't necessarily print their own money out of existence. They have to depend on the central banks for that, or the member banks. And we'll kind of get into that because we're approaching the section on Bretton Woods here. So kind of going to what their main goal is, the IMF, it's in their own words, it works to foster global growth and economic stability by providing policy advice and financing the members by working with developing countries to help them achieve macroeconomic stability and reduce poverty. And so there were two mental frameworks at Bretton Woods on what this institution would look like. One came from Harry Dexter White, who was the chief strategist from America, and he was basically like, let's make this just kind of as a bank works to make sure that these countries are good on their loans. And then we had John Maynard Keynes, who kind of wanted a central bank of the world to issue a central bank of the world currency, which he wanted to call the Bancor, which didn't really come to fruition. But we had something like an SDR, which we'll get into later. But the main goal was that Keynes had was to relinquish governments from the constraints of having the gold exchange rate. And again, that's just control of like the global money supply and not having like this free markets, real kind of rates exchange thing happen organically. And so these large governments were fearing that free market competition once again. And it was a method by which gold was to be eliminated in international trade, and it was to be replaced by that quasi bancor thing by the IMF, and it would act as the world central bank, which would create the currency out of nothing, but again, being dependent on central banks of the world. So, uh, arguably, this kind of goes back to like a social program. It was almost a method where you could argue world socialism was to be established via the World Bank transferring money to banks in the world that needed it during economic times, disguised as loans to those governments of underdeveloped countries. They underdeveloped countries, or LDCs, least developed countries, as they say in textbooks, are the ones that are most dependent on the World Bank, and they do so in such a way to ensure the demise of free enterprise. And so the money is the way it's going to work, and we're going to about to get into how it works, but it's to like the money gets delivered from the World Bank into the hands of politicians and bureaucrats, and more politicians and bureaucrats, because that's who's running this, whether it's politicians and bureaucrats at the World Bank and IMF, or the ones to the less developed countries that they loan out the money to. And to get into more of the nitty gritty of how it works, the IMF collects funds from member nations to sit in member nations' accounts at the World Bank, and it's kind of like a donation basis. The members of these countries donate funds on a quota basis. So capital comes from the more industrialized nations, which the United States is, putting up most of that capital. Or you can also think of as them as MDCs, the more developed countries. And so they're funding the IMF and World Bank. And the US, the last I checked, makes up 20% of the funds in the world that goes to the IMF/World Bank. And that's
Hmm.
paid by the Federal Reserve, which,
I'm
the Fed
surprised it's
is
not higher,
funded by
to be honest.
taxpayers.
Yeah, but I mean
Yeah, and
that's 20% is still ridiculously high to be that amount for the World Bank. I mean, that's none of our business.
yeah, that number I found in this has been really instrumental in my understanding The Creature from Jekyll Island. So G. Edward Griffin, that's where I pull that number from, but I'm sure it's changed a bit since you look back. So that was released in 94, that book. So it very well could be different now. I haven't looked. I'm still in the process of making this essay. This is going to be part two in the series on Bitcoin Magazine.
Okay.
But
Well, that's going to be an awesome essay then. I look forward to that.
yeah, I'm a little intimidated by it, but I'm just taking it piece by piece. There's so much you can talk about, but you know, it's my goal to just really funnel this out and just kind of hit him with the meat.
Yeah. So basically to recap, and I also read The Creature from Jekyll Island. That was a few years ago. There's a lot of information there. I don't entirely remember everything. I need to reread it. But
And I would take what is said in there with a grain of salt, because you could argue that there's an agenda for a new world order and a new world government, and the World Bank is the thing that funds it. And I don't know if it's that explicit. Well, in the real world, it's probably not that explicit, but it gets kind of like kooky conspiratorial. And
toward the
as
end, a little bit. Yeah.
especially that, but there's so many building blocks that lead up to that, and I don't want to discredit the work that I put out as some conspiracy kook. And it's very doomsday, mostly because we don't have Bitcoin. But it is interesting to take everything that any conspirator says with a grain of salt. And by the way, conspiracy is not like a icky bad word. And I mean, it was created by like the
The
CIA and to
CIA.
conspire.
Yeah. It's the most
Yeah.
logical thing in the world. Is it really that crazy to say that rich people who have, if you're rich, you have a lot of power, and you're really going to try and tell me that powerful people aren't going to try and like talk to each other privately? Because that's all it is. That's all a conspiracy is they're conspiring, against a larger group of people. So the phrase "you're a conspiracy theorist" is nuts. But I want to recap on what you were saying earlier. So just to make sure we're all on the same page. So basically, the majority of the funding from the IMF goes to underdeveloped countries. The IMF gets money through the World Bank. The World Bank gets 20% of its money from the United States Federal Reserve.
Yes, and the rest is made up of other strong countries. So probably France's central bank, Germany's, and like those funds consist of partly hard currencies.
Okay.
It's fun to say hard currencies because it's all fiat bullshit. But this currencies consisted, or as when this was written, the dollar, of course, yen, mark, the franc. But these are augmented by many. They've been augmented many times, that the amount in the form of credits. So it's not just straight up like currencies. These currencies are created as credits, and that's where we get into the creation of the SDR. So the SDR you could think of as Keynes's Bancor, and I like to. I first coined this as a major hat tip to the Canadian Bitcoin podcast, because they were talking about this. And I believe Joey's the name of the co-host, but I reached out to him on Twitter, like, dude, that was great info. Where'd you find that? And he's just like, it's on the IMF's website itself. But he looks at it as the SDR is kind of the shitcoin of the world, and the global shitcoin casino is the World Bank. And so the way the SDR works, I believe, is that it acts as a shitcoin token credit in order for you to buy your other shitcoin currencies that your government needs wherever you are in the world to fund your infrastructure project, or whatever reason you're taking out a loan from the IMF in the first place. And if you hold more SDRs than you do the currencies, you're penalized for it. So you get charged interest, and this asset that you need and depend on, if you have too much of it, it's a liability. Or in another way, it acts kind of like negative interest rates. And so these credits are merely just promises that the member governments are going to get the money from taxpayers if the bank gets into trouble with its loans. So it also kind of acts like an FDIC in a way. And so those loans are sent for infrastructure and to rebuild, whatever third world country's economy. And it's kind of similar to like how Germany was demolished through economic warfare, which I talk about in my piece that just came out, how they suffered hyperinflation because they were just kind of outspent during World War II. And so you can kind of think of the failure of the Germany economy kind of like as a guinea pig for what happened to LDCs in later years. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
So these nations have SDRs, and essentially the SDRs help them. They can redeem the SDRs
The
for.
SDRs are the SDRs dismantle gold. It replaced gold, and that's how the World Bank and IMF fix the exchange rate instead of gold, because they
I
can
see.
control this instead of being reliant on the gold exchange rate, which was just based on how much gold can any crappy currency or non-crappy currency buy with a single unit of their currency. And so there was like a free market valuation of gold in this exchange rate policy at the time. But that was replaced by the STR.
Do you know when that was?
I want to say 1970s when the SDR came into full effect.
Okay, so
right
71.
before gold came off, the gold standard.
Right,
But
in 71. Yeah.
this idea also kind of parallels at the same time like a organic happening in the world, because everyone was pegged to the gold/dollar standard because everyone was dependent on rebuilding their economies by taking out and being dependent on the dollar, because America became the world superpower. And then what led to um, the depegging of gold in 1971, when Richard took us off the gold exchange window, is all these other countries demanding their gold reserves back because they just knew that funny business was going on. America was trying to fund the Vietnam War, and that wasn't becoming popular because of the news of all the killings that were happening. And it was just like a bank run of everyone's gold reserves on America. So you have all these like things happening at once. So I thought it would only be fair that I mentioned that as well. And I cover that more in depth in the recent piece too.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So, I mean, that one obvious like reason why this would be a bad thing, excuse me, is because of their, I mean, most likely intentional, but we can't prove that, but of them basically taking the world off of a gold standard. So you have 1944, Bretton Woods, basically the majority of the world's most powerful nations come together. They say that we are all going to peg the value of our currency to the US dollar. And we're doing this because the US dollar is backed by gold. 1971 comes around. Nixon quote, temporarily takes us off of the gold standard. And then SDRs come about. And basically, SDRs are these more or less tokens that allow underdeveloped nations to redeem for actual currency that they need in order to pay for things. So if I was a Keynesian, I went to college, I listened to my communist professors, I'm just totally like, and I hate Bitcoin too. And and I said, okay, well, we need the IMF. We need the IMF to, help these poor, underdeveloped countries pay for roads and infrastructure and healthcare and all these things. And you're a bad person, Phil. What's your response? Why is this a negative for the world versus being a positive for the world?
Well, this is a nice segue into the next section of, we covered kind of how it works, but the next question is, does it work?
Yeah.
And this goes into how it really works. So the short answer is that no, it doesn't work. And the people that benefit are the ones that are already in power, are rich, are the bureaucrats, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, similar to what you saw during hyperinflation in Germany. And as hyperinflation happened, people that had assets were able to pay off debt easier, and their assets just appreciated in value. But that aside, so for the rich and powerful, yes, this does work. This is good for them. For people that need to take out these loans, they have to follow the terms of the IMF, and this usually results in cutting spending on infrastructure to just work on austerity and rebuild their economy that way. So countries are forced to print more money, which can lead to hyperinflation and maybe even become dollarized. I'm not entirely sure how El Salvador uh, was dollarized. I haven't looked into that. I know they got dollarized in 2001. I believe that America helped back them during the Civil War. So I'm not really sure, but just some interesting things to keep in mind.
Hmm.
And so again, for another recap, because recaps are important, the
Yep.
IMF is becoming the bank for the world, and the bank is serving as its lending arm. And as such, it's become more of the engine for transferring wealth from the industrialized nations, MDCs, to the underdeveloped countries, or LDCs. And so while this has lowered the economic level of the donating countries, it has not raised the level of the recipients. So the money has simply disappeared down the drain of political corruption and waste. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and this this occurs through a very interesting way. I mentioned this book already, but if you haven't, please pick up the book, The New Confessions, not just The Confessions, but the updated version that came out in 2014 or 15, I think. The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. And it's more of a explanation of how colonialism, how the American empire expanded, because wars aren't popular. We'll do those through proxy wars, CIA strategies to fund those proxy wars.
Yep.
That comes from money from arguably the World Bank to the Federal Reserve, or taxpayers, and everyone ends up funding this totalitarianism and these war crimes. But I'm just kind of looking through my notes. I think we've about covered everything, but I do want to get into how the economic hitman strategy works.
Yeah.
Before that, do you have any other questions or anything you want to mention?
Yeah. I mean, I really just, I would love to hear. I also need to read that book, The New Confessions of the Economic Hitman. Um, yeah, I'd really like to just hear about that. And, I'm sure you're going to explain the detrimental, impacts of all of this too, other than just getting poor nations in debt, really, which is, I would imagine, the biggest one. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is essentially, like I said, how American Empire was able to continue. So the way it works is that it's funny. They say private corporations from the United States go down to these countries, emerging economies, and they are they approach the world leaders of these countries as consultants. And John Perkins, this is what he did, and he describes it in the book, is that this was the era of Keynesian economics. So he first got into this business in the early 70s, and he would use Keynesian economic models to inflate these projections of, let's say, that a country's economy has 7% growth annually or on a 5-year period or whatever. But if the world leader was convinced or bribed by an economic hitman from this quote unquote private corporation in America to take out a loan from the IMF, and that loan would go from the IMF to the Treasury Department in the US, and that money would go to the US corporations and companies to provide the infrastructure to the third world country that we're talking about. Then instead of 7% growth annually or whatever, it would be 20. And this did create infrastructure. I mean, clean water, electricity, whatever it might be. I think the most crucial one is in Ecuador, where Chevron, or actually I think it was Texaco, found their oil reserves, and basically they made the leader of the country do this. And basically, when this happens, when they get the oil out, they these countries become owned by the corporatocracy, is what John Perkins describes it as, the corporatocracy. And I mean, these loans never get paid back. Essentially, these countries are forced to default, and arguably, in the Creature from Jekyll Island, that is the end goal, to have all these countries default and either get dollarized or be dependent on the World Bank, and they just get owned by these American corporations or other corporations in the world. And if this leader of the country does not agree to play by the EHM rules, economic hitman rules, then they either get taken out via a coup, which has happened in many countries, Ecuador, Chile,
Gaddafi.
Panama. Hmm?
Gaddafi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that either happens, or in some cases too, they die in a plane crash.
Well, yeah, that happens sometimes. People get
Yeah.
suicided. You find people with two-bit bullet holes in their head, or like William Casey, who died when he was out boating, or apparently they said he was out boating and he had a heart attack or something, and his dinner was hot on the table. Happens all the
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Lost it in a boating accident.
Yep. Exactly. Yep. Yeah. It's all pretty nuts. It seems that, from the beginning of the 20th century, particularly in 1913, which was a very shitty year for America. I mean, you have the income tax that started in 1913, and then you had the creation of the Federal Reserve. And I guess my point on all this is it seems that since that time period, power has been, seeked to be more centrally controlled. So, before you had all these independent countries, and now you have, a bunch of these countries getting dollarized and depending on the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And regardless of whether or not you think there's going to be some one world government or whatever, this stuff is, I don't think it's that crazy to think. I mean, we have all these non-governmental organizations like the World Health Organizations, the World Economic Forum, and, all of these things, and they all have things in common. They all generally don't want free societies. They all don't like Bitcoin. Yeah. Anyways, real detrimental stuff they're doing. It's, so moving on to that, as far as how Bitcoin relates with this, how do you see Bitcoin as a solution? I mean, El Salvador is a great example of that, but at the same time, they had a president who was willing to do something like unprecedented and make Bitcoin basically their national currency. So, how does Bitcoin fix this?
That that's going to be an interesting thing to watch play out. Before I get into that, I do want to mention that it's not just since the dawn of the Federal Reserve this crap's been happening. Alex Gladstein, putting out great work. I feel like I'm kind of neck and neck with the topics that we're trying to discuss in both of our articles. But countries were doing this mercantilism, colonialism thing like centuries before this. The French are a big one. He talks about them colonizing Africa. I think going back to like the late 1800s, and French were also trying to do that in Indonesia, or was it that or Vietnam? I don't know, maybe both. But yeah, this has been happening, and it's only, I guess, through passing of time and war forcing people to come together. I say people, not the people. I mean leaders of countries come together to get a stranglehold on the money supply. They can't do that with Bitcoin, and they will try. And it's really ironic how the IMF, in response to what El Salvador is doing, said that there's like efficacy issues and like transparency issues with using Bitcoin. And I'm just like, motherfucker, all right, IMF, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. Let's go down the list of all the countries that have been victims of you using debt as a weapon against them and leaving them with no other choice. And I would love to believe that is what Bukele is doing in El Salvador. And I'd say that I would love to believe because, again, he's a politician. Politicians have incentives, but I would love for the world that he actually wants to do this for his people. So if anyone's not familiar with how this works in El Salvador with Bitcoin, they are using Strike as kind of their government sponsored wallet. Maybe government sponsor is not the right way to put it, but they're using Strike in the government of El Salvador for everyone to use kind of as like the training wheels. They can use any other Bitcoin wallet if they want. But Strike is cool because in a way, the government is kind of depending or banking on that merchants in El Salvador are going to sell their Bitcoin for the fiat dollars that they depend on. Because not only is Bitcoin now legal tender, but before that, as I mentioned, El Salvador was dollarized in 2001. And Strike is great because, especially in El Salvador, they don't have any realized capital gain. So they can sell, if they are a merchant and they sell chicken and you can pay in Bitcoin, they can hold on to that Bitcoin if they want for savings, or they don't want to mess with the volatility. So they sell the value of that Bitcoin for fiat dollars by using Strike. So they hold dollars now. And where that Bitcoin goes is to a infrastructure fund at the El Salvador government. And once this fund reaches, I believe it's 150 million in US dollars through the appreciation of Bitcoin, that fund will then pay for infrastructure. So it's kind of like a flippening of the economic hitman game of this is how you actually change a country, by funding the infrastructure and being self-reliant and not depending on the IMF and the World Bank and
Right.
not being completely screwed over. It's the biggest middle finger to these institutions that have just been detrimental to developing countries. Now, whether or not it's actually going to benefit the people, uh, we just have to wait and hope for the very best and see how this plays out.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't want to sound like, a doom and gloom guy or just a pessimist. I'm we just don't know. We just don't know. And I wish all the best to BKB. Like, he seems like a badass, and he's young and inspiring, but then again, he's still a politician.
Yep.
So how this
Exactly.
plays out, maybe there's going to be some more dominoes. Like, there's talks of, well, today the Mexican billionaire said that it's important that people buy Bitcoin, and we had talks of Paraguay, which I think is questionable because those guys were, or some people were talking about just crypto in general, not focusing solely on Bitcoin. But again, we're going to see this jurisdictional arbitrage work out between nation states, as we already started to kind of see in Florida. I live in Texas, and Texas is now considered Bitcoin mining country,
Yeah, that's
and
pretty awesome.
it's pretty epic. And then recently, New York State's, the guy that's running for governor to replace what's his dick is saying, "Oh, you basically forget the oh my god, what's it called? The act that Ripple Deed made. Oh my god,
Uh
Ben Lowski's bit license. Forget that.
oh yeah, that's right. New York's bit license.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So he said, forget that. We're coming for you, Florida, and all these other countries. So we're seeing this jurisdictional arbitrage play out. And now again, how much is that true, and how much is it political rhetoric to just use for this high time preference strategy of getting people's votes in? And are they
Yeah.
going to deliver on these promises? At
So
the end of
that
the day, Bitcoin is still going to be what Bitcoin is, as completely sound money, separate from state, and will be there for the people. And it'll be free open source code and software that will actually start to make the changes happen. Government be damned. So it's just going to be really interesting, if I haven't said that enough, to see what happens.
yeah. I mean, sorry to cut you off earlier. That just makes me think of like game theory. And sure, some countries are like China, they're going to ban it. But ultimately, and especially 10 years from now, given Bitcoin continues its exponential growth, which I don't see why it wouldn't continue to keep doing that with the amount of adoption we're having. But yeah, the game theory is really at play here. So, I mean, a lot of people would say, okay, well, there's no way a government would ever want to relinquish their power and let go of you know the crazy ability to be able to create money out of thin air and pay for anything with it. But then you have smaller countries, like especially in Latin America, that have historically really suffered from inflation, and maybe it makes more sense for them to operate on a Bitcoin standard, get their country a lot more prosperous. Get tourism coming in from Westerners who maybe have Bitcoin who want to come in, and really, if you're a politician, like that's kind of a net positive. Um, but as far as the U.S., I mean, do you think that? Because here's my personal opinion. I think with smaller countries, it's entirely possible that this is going to continue happening, and I think it will. But I picture us getting to a certain point where this becomes an issue for the United States and for the IMF and the Fed and all that. And I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I know historically you have people like Gaddafi, who from Libya. Gaddafi tried to get his nation internationally trading using gold and not the U.S. dollar, and then he got killed. So, and that's no coincidence. So I wonder what's going to happen here. I wonder how this relates to the United States and the Federal Reserve. And, I mean, because we're still so early. I don't think they've fully woken up to how dangerous this thing can truly be for them. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they have.
No, the cool thing is though, and I love going to Catch App and you get to scroll down and see all these very bullish headlines from Bitcoin Magazine and the Block and others. But I'm just gonna read a couple of headlines I saw earlier. Oh no, are they all gone? Whatever. I mean, like every day you see more companies adding Bitcoin to their balance sheet or making more financial instruments to allow people to buy Bitcoin. And so the United States is going to be the last one to make this stuff legal tender or anything. But as Guy Swan likes to talk about a lot, it's going to be the new standard, the new protocol of finance. Like the internet's just works. Email just works. You don't have to know how it works, but it just does. And it's going to be the internet of money, the financial rail that powers finances and makes it easier. So maybe think of a bunch of, strike competitors at maybe a state level or a jurisdiction level or like the entire country. And again, like governments be damned. This is free and open source software. Code is code should not be banned. Like code is free speech.
Yep.
And Bitcoin is free speech. And the market provides, and the market really provides in spite of statism and authoritarianism. And so that's what Bitcoin's going to be doing for countries like America, because these banks and just the legacy rails are outdated and breaking, and they're going to need to find ways of making more money and keeping business, keeping their customers. So Bitcoin's the way to do that, which it seems it would be the most logical way to do that because CDs don't fucking work, right?
No.
And love them or hate them, companies like BlockFi are kind of leading the way in this. This is financial advice. Do your own homework, whether or not you want to use those. I don't, but you have things like HODL HODL, and you have, and I didn't really know this until recently, but Robert Kiyosaki, the big real estate dude, is a huge Bitcoin bull.
Yep.
And he always talked about leveraging your assets and borrowing against it. And Bitcoin becomes the real estate that the average Joe off the street can buy into and invest in. And again, this kind of goes into the buy, borrow, die mentality, because the whole borrowing, people are going to borrow capital either way. You're going to have like debitors and creditors, of course, for the creation of money, even under like a Bitcoin standard. But, I think Bitcoin replaces that model because it will be the true assets, the most pristine form of collateral ever. And that gives the little guy an opportunity, because even if they invest like, 20, $50 a week, month, whatever, how much over whatever duration of time, that's gonna appreciate. And 10 years down the road, that can be their retirement, or they'll borrow against it, I guess, and have their heirs be left with that debt. But if that asset is in their position and Bitcoin's going to do what we know it's going to do, it's just going to keep appreciating, and everybody is able to do what Michael Saylor did and perform that speculative attack on the dollar with this new form of collateral, this asset that every person in the world can have. So that's kind of the first world countries' privilege strategy of how they're going to leverage Bitcoin, I think. And then they'll eventually cave because everyone else is going to adopt it as legal tender too. And as I mentioned in the piece that I put out, people are losing faith in the dollar. Russia has completely de-dollarized their assets and sold their treasuries and are going to implement, they say, quote unquote, crypto. I hope they mean Bitcoin, but they're going to depend on that as trading with the axis of evil powers.
they're like, here's your new CBDC, here's your crypto.
Well, they're definitely going to do that too, but at the end of the day, I think incentives matter, and the asset that everybody is going to value and want is going to be Bitcoin. And yeah, I mean, they'll probably have their CBDCs too, but like the underlying asset that they'll use to like exchange maybe goods will be Bitcoin. I don't know. I haven't really looked too much into that, but people are losing faith in the dollar. China's selling their treasuries to fund their Belt and Road Initiative, which is like their version of the economic hitman thing and they've been taking notes on what America's done over the years, I think, and that's how they're going to fight back against dollar hegemony. And it's happening. People are, yes, losing faith in the dollar, but overall losing faith in fiat, and Bitcoin is the flippening, as we say.
Yeah, it definitely is the flippening. It's almost, I mean, I've heard the analogy of Airbnb and Uber, like especially in New York, there were huge monopolies on taxi companies, and the government and private businesses were in bed with each other, and we're able to benefit each other. And then Uber came along and just totally destroyed their business model. And I also know these companies didn't ask for permission, like it was kind of almost questionable whether or not like it would continue to be legal, Airbnb and Uber. And then they just grew so large that it got to a point where it was not feasible to stop them from doing what they're doing. And Bitcoin is definitely going to be the same thing. I mean, here's the thing, even if there's some sort of like federal mandate against Bitcoin in the United States, I am pretty damn sure that individual states will reject that. At least Florida and Texas. I mean, and you see that with the vaccines. Here we go. We're gonna get banned. Vaccine stuff. I got banned my 5th episode, so I'll try and block that word out. But anyways, you get where I'm going with that. I mean, you got like Texas and Florida saying that they're not even going to allow vaccine passports to be a requirement or a thing. I mean, it just all boils down to that jurisdictional thing. And then eventually, people are going to be able to pick up and move to places where they want to live. I mean, they're going to have more of an incentive. Why would I stay in this state that taxes me so much, has so many rules and regulations against Bitcoin? I can just move here and have a better life. And eventually a lot of people are going to be doing that. So
100%, dude. It's the sovereign individual thesis playing out. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And markets work. Going back to the Uber and Airbnb model, yeah, they did it without permission. And the irony is, even if their VCs funded it with money that is kind of dependent on like fiat, and there's an argument that fiat kind of funds both good and bad ideas, Bitcoin's going to be the only rational economic choice to park your wealth. And so you have, thankfully, all this fiat, again, going with the whole speculative attack idea, you have all this fiat flooding into Bitcoin eventually, or maybe companies like Airbnb and Uber, maybe somehow. But yeah, the economics is really inherent and intuitive, and people don't really realize it, but economics and the whole pricing mechanism determines human behavior and interaction. And it will be, I keep saying this, but it's so fun and true to say that Bitcoin will be just the default no-brainer, rational decision to choose, the option, choice.
Yeah.
Like the biggest problem in this world is, yes, the money, but like we don't have the freedom to choose. Like, wasn't it God, economists Uh, you know,
While you're
you were
thinking of
afraid to
that,
choose.
yeah, I mean that's the thing is we've never had a choice with money. Like we have only had to we've only been able to use the money that governments force on people, which is insane. It's insane. I totally agree. It's going to be just the logical thing to do. Why would you not have Bitcoin? And like it's almost like gold is equivalent to Blockbuster, and Bitcoin is like Netflix. It's like why would you inconvenience yourself just to watch a movie? You can just do this one super simple thing and get entertained. Same thing with Bitcoin. It's like, why would you transact in this currency, which is clearly has an infinite supply, loses its value? It's going to make your life a lot worse if you hold it. Why would you not just have Bitcoin? And and I talked about how this relates with maximalism too, because everybody hates on Bitcoin maximalists, but they have no idea how much they need Bitcoin maximalists. Like you need a group of seemingly insane yet extremely devoted people if you want an actual revolution to happen. There's no other way. You need a group of people who are so dedicated to something that they are literally willing to die for it. And that is how the world gets changed, when you just have a big group of uncompromising people all having the same ideology, and that is Bitcoin. And nothing will stop us at this point. I mean, we've got people in all these different countries. We've got a nation on the Bitcoin standard. Tons of corporations hold it. Even Mercado Libre, it's like the eBay of Mexico here. They have Bitcoin. So it's just a matter of time before we are on a Bitcoin standard, and it's not even thought about. It's just, okay, everybody has Bitcoin. So
Exactly, man. You need that intransigent minority to lead the way, like the loud minority, the true believers. But there is a learning curve, right? Because you still have a bunch of gold bugs, and slowly but surely that's going away. But it's gonna be a learning curve, and it's not gonna happen overnight. But again, Milton Friedman, thank you, neurons, for coming back to my rescue. Today must be my Monday. But again, I was able to find those headlines. We got all coming from Bitcoin Magazine, world's largest interdealer broker, TP ICAP, to launch Bitcoin trading platform. Argo Blockchain secures 20 million Bitcoin-backed loan to expand Texas mining farm. Founder behind alleged 2.3 billion Bitcoin scam pushes against victims' claims. You just have these people taking this seriously, and it's only going to be a matter of time. Again, people are going to be left with a choice, but kind of like the only choice.
yeah, that's very true. All bullish, all bullish. Well, hey man, I really enjoyed talking about all this stuff with you. I feel like there's so many other like topics we can just discuss, just liberty in general, and the lockdown stuff. That's a fun one too, right? But
I just don't want to get you banned.
I'm gonna do some editing, so yeah, that'll be all right. But yeah, man, I really enjoyed it. I would love to have you on again in the future. And yeah, it was a great time. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Likewise, dude. Thank you so much for having me. I hope everything we went over was coherent. Again, I'm still kind of working on this essay, and coming on the show and prepping was actually kind of what I needed, kind of like a kick in the ass. So like, okay, narrow down your thoughts, structure it up a little bit. So I think this was a really healthy, helpful exercise, but I enjoyed it. Yes, definitely. I'd love to come back on, talk more about liberty in general. Yeah, well, fuck that. We don't need that. We have Bitcoin. So,
yeah, exactly.
But yeah,
that's the Trojan horse for liberty. Yep.
Exactly. I loved it.
Sure,
if
man.
anybody wants to find me, again, Mr. Pseu, Phil Gibson on Twitter. My handle is MRPSEU. My podcast is A Boy Named Pseu. Throughout episode a week, try to, sometimes two. And again, I'm a musician. That's my main passion. And if you want to help out, contribute, in a way, join the band, or fund my efforts, and you don't even have to like send me stats. Like my strike little tag is P Gibbs, PGIBS, but To learn more, or even I think read my article that I put out on Citadel 21 to give you more like background, like who I am and all that, you can go to etf615.com. And other than that, if you just have Bitcoin questions in general, follow me on Twitter, hit me up, and yeah, buy Bitcoin.
Buy Bitcoin. Stat sacks. Thank you very much, brother. Have a good one.
You too, bro. Thanks.